If it's all right with you, I would like to shift our attention now to the period leading to 1066. The King of England, Edward the Confessor, didn't have any children, hence no direct heirs. Throughout his 14 years of reign, he kept looking for potential successors. As a matter of fact, he may have promised the throne to William on several occasions. The first time, I'd say probably as early as, I don't know, 1051. But we also know that the Duke of Normandy wasn't the only candidate, and Edward surely considered several others. What should we make of this vacillation on Edward's part? Does it have anything to do with his own complicated accession to the throne?
It very much does. So basically, if you sort of wanted to do kind of a zero sum game for where Edward was in his thoughts about the succession, it was, if the case of Duke William is here, then the case of the Godwinson family is here, and vice versa. So there's an inverse relationship between his support for the Godwinsons and his support for Duke William. There's basically two main alternatives, um, to either go in that direction or go with Duke William. Then you have a third possibility, and this is really the wild card. So in 1054, he throws what an American would think of as a Hail Mary pass, which is, like, let's go for it, let's see if this works. It's a long shot. And he tries to find the long lost heir. So this is his uh, half nephew, Edward, just to make things confusing. Um, Historians call him Edward the Exile, just to help us keep them apart. And he had been in exile since 1016. So he, as a very, very young child, was sent out of England on the death of his father, Edmund Ironside, who was shunted away, um, who was killed or died naturally, depends on your source, in 1016 when Canute came to the throne. And Canute had the young children of his former rival, Edmund Ironside, sent to Scandinavia with the presumption that they would be quietly made away with, which did not occur. They ended up by, some sort of route that we can't recover in Hungary. And one of these young boys survived, grew to adulthood. Um, this is Edward the Exile, marries, has children, and he's hanging out in Hungary in the 1050s when all of a sudden Edward the Confessor remembers him and decides to go find him and bring him back to England. So he sends an envoy. It takes a while to locate him because nobody knows he's in Hungary. But they find him and they finally convince him to come back to England. This is your moment. He's back in England by 1057. By that point, Edward the Confessor, Edward, he should also have been nicknamed the Vacillator, changes his mind, doesn't see him, doesn't receive him. And so he's
They weren't
basically
even
just sort of
speaking the same language, so it was
right.
normal.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, we have no assurance that Edward the Exile could speak English at all, right? So he dies a month later, before Edward the Confessor, many years before Edward the Confessor, leaving these three children, and they're just sort of quietly there. Um, and there isn't a huge big deal made out of the boy. There's two girls and a boy being the next heir. He is referred to as Edgar Atheling, Edgar the Throneworthy, but he's not groomed to be king. He is not. Everybody doesn't say, "Oh, well, of course, Edgar will, as the heir of the House of Wessex, will certainly become king." That is not the presumption. And then you're back to the whole William versus Harold thing. So Harold Godwinson, the brother-in-law of the king, the most important member of this really rich and powerful Anglo-Danish family, uh, is the guy on the spot, and William of Normandy is the guy in Normandy. And that's really where things stand in early 1066 when Edward the Confessor finally dies, and there is at that point no clarity about what should happen.
The waters are muddied even further by the tapestry. William turned from a protege of the King of France into a serious rival. He was able to stop Henry's machinations in 1054 by winning the Battle of Mortimer, as you've mentioned earlier, to outgeneral both the king and his ally Geoffrey of Anjou at Varaville 3 years later, and eventually he managed to seize Maine in 1063. Bayeux tapestry illustrates the moment when Edward sent his brother-in-law Harold Godwinson to Normandy to inform William that he was the king's choice for the succession. If this really happened, do you think it came as a recognition of William's remarkable achievements prior to 1064?
It's entirely possible. Now, the question of what happened in 1064 when Harold ended up in Normandy is vexed on many fronts. There are lots of points at which you could actually debate what was really going on. The sources on the English and Norman side are unclear on a number of points. They disagree on a number of points. We know that Harold went to Normandy, um, but he didn't end up there immediately. He didn't land in Normandy. He landed in Ponthieu. Now, why is that? Was he blown off course? He was heading to Normandy all the time? Or was he never going to Normandy in the first place? You will get sources that disagree on this point. I'll tell you what I think. I think he was going to Normandy, and I think it's possible that he had more than one item on his agenda. He may have been sent directly by Edward to discuss the succession. There is some sign that he may have also intended to forge some sort of alliance with William, an arrangement about what would happen after the succession. Like Harold would be saying, like, I'm the number one guy next to the king now. I would like that to continue when you are king. There's even some thought that there may have been a proposed marriage alliance between Harold and William, between their children. If so, nothing ever came of that. Um, but there's another thing that he could have been doing there, which could have even been enough of a reason to go to Normandy without a message from King Edward, which is that his own brother, Wulfnoth, was a hostage at the Norman ducal court, and his nephew was as well, and had been for over a decade by this point. So he could have been intending to negotiate the release of his nephew and his brother. If so, that did not occur because they remained in ducal captivity for years and years after this. So there's a lot going on. And then you come to the oath, right? So there's this depiction in the tapestry of Harold taking an oath. But what is he swearing? There are words on the tapestry, and all it says is he's taking an oath. It doesn't say what the oath said. The tapestry is very terse in terms of there's not a lot of words. We don't know exactly what he swore to do, but he clearly swore something because years later, the English sources figure out ways to explain the oath away. And if the oath didn't happen, they would have just said, that's a lie. There was no oath.
Sure.
But there clearly has to have been some sort of oath because they come up with reasons why the oath was coerced, in which case it would have been invalid under canon law, which would have gotten Harold out of it. But I think he swore something, and he may have sworn to support William. And if that's the case, what happens in January of 1066? It depends on how you interpret the so-called deathbed bequest. So Edward the Confessor falls ill at the very end of 1065. He's clearly on his deathbed, and supposedly he bequeaths the kingdom to Harold at that point. So if Edward had intended for the kingdom to go to William earlier and had sent Harold in 1064 to say, yeah, we're definitely doing that, he went back on it on his deathbed. Now, under English law, a deathbed bequest could override a previous arrangement. So Harold may have felt duty bound to respect the deathbed bequest.
That absolves him of any wrongdoing.
Absolves him of perjury, right? On the other hand, one has to ask the question lawyers ask, which is cui bono? Who does it benefit? Right? Benefits Harold, right? Now, the Witan, the close advisors of the king, they ratify this deathbed bequest. And they had very good reasons for doing so. Harold is right there. Harold has a lot of land and a lot of power. If he were to oppose William, that would have been very awkward. We'd already had, during Edward's reign, at least one major confrontation between the Godwinson family and Edward that was only smoothed over with great difficulty. And so the idea may have been, we're better off just with the devil we know this guy Harold, he's right here, he's ready on day one, let's just go with this. Also, he's English. We don't know this William guy very well. If he's been to England, it's only once or twice. And so that's what they did.
And it is very likely William would have been the third option after Edgar Atheling because he was there too. They had plenty of candidates to choose from before even considering the Duke of Normandy.
That's true. But the thing that's interesting is I don't think Edgar Atheling really came into the running at this point, which is because he was young, inexperienced, and not at all groomed for power. So he had not grown up the way William did. So William, as I said, grew up in the school of hard knocks. He knew what the military life was about from an early age. Edgar Atheling had been sitting around pretty much. He was not ready to rule, and it would have been a real risk to put him in. And I don't think it would have been very healthy for Edgar, because I think Harold would have had a good reason to arrange an accident. I don't think Edgar's life would have been very long. And this, I will say this for Edgar Atheling. Edgar Atheling knew when to hold him and when to fold him. He was very good at figuring out when to be submissive. So he gave up when it was strategic to give up. And he died in his bed at the age of 75, having outlasted a lot of these people. And if you are the legitimate heir of the Wessex dynasty and you manage to negotiate this whole period without anybody thinking they need to kill you, you have played politics pretty well if your aim is to survive, at least. He never ends up as a powerful person. He makes a few attempts, but when they don't work, he backs off, which turned out to be a successful strategy for him.
So we get to the moment when King Edward expired on January 5th, 1066. According to the English sources, Harold may have been crowned as early as the day of the Feast of the Epiphany. In the context of that oath we talked about earlier, William obviously found all of this outrageous and turned the whole situation into a personal crusade. how big a strain on Normandy was this decision made by William to go on a, I don't know, let's say a punitive expedition, and what did it entail from a logistical standpoint?
It was a huge undertaking. It was really kind of a mad thing to think of. If you think about other people who've tried an amphibious landing of Britain and have not managed to pull it off, you can start with, the Spanish Armada, Napoleon, Hitler. All of them have tried to do this. None of them succeeded. Um, the two things that you need if you're going to invade England are men and ships. And you need a lot of both of those things. And in the Middle Ages, it is not easy to assemble a lot of men or a lot of ships. But William succeeded in doing that. So, to keep in mind, he can't just tell his men they have to go because they're not actually obliged to follow him overseas. They're supposed to help him defend Normandy, and this is not part of that. This is really something that he's doing on spec. And so he has to convince them to go. And we have later reports of what the discussion was around the council table. And obviously, we don't really know what was said. Um, what we probably have here is historians rehearsing arguments that might have been made. Uh, but basically, he's able to prevail. He's able to convince people, no, this is worth doing, and we can do it. And he assembles a coalition not just of Normans, but of Bretons, and Flemings and people from other parts of France. So there's a lot of people who think this is worth trying because we're going to get rich out of it. So that's the kind of leader that William was. He had a track record. People thought this was going to be a success. He also needs to build a lot of ships because you don't have lying around in this period the kind of fleet that can carry 8,000 guys and several thousand horses across the English Channel. So they basically gather together all the ships that already exist. We have a list, in fact, a ship list that lists the contributions, and then he had to build a lot of ships. And there are actually illustrations on the Bayeux tapestry of some of the ships being built. And there's a later story that Duchess Matilda contributed the flagship that William sailed in across the channel, and that was his special ship, the Mora. So they have to get them together, and then they have to wait for the wind. And they wait and they wait and they wait. And the whole time that they're waiting, they have to eat. And so basically, for 2 months, you have 8,000 guys and a couple thousand horses who need to eat. And a historian has actually calculated how many carts of grain probably had to be brought in while they were waiting around, and also how many carts had to take away the waste products that were generated by that many men and horses lying around doing nothing for all that time. So it was a testament to his logistical skills. First of all, that people didn't just drift away. There are many incidents of armies that sort of evaporated over time if they weren't given enough to do. It was also a testament to his ability to keep the camp relatively hygienic, that they didn't succumb to disease, because one of the hugest risks to a medieval army was disease. You get that many human beings in one place in medieval conditions, and they give each other diseases. And that didn't happen. So they are actually able to hold it together for the whole time it takes for the wind in the channel to turn.